So I'll quote just briefly from your op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal, in which you said President Trump should work with congressional Republicans to incorporate additional free trade features in the USMCA's implementing legislation so that it can be passed before the next Congress is sworn in on January 3, 2019. Explain why that is so important that you get this done in what is called the lame duck.
Well, let me unpack this a little bit. In my view, the agreement that the administration has negotiated is frankly not really as good as the underlying Nafta, the original Nafta. But it's not terrible, and with a few tweaks that move it in the direction of a more pro-trade agreement, then it's something I could support, and I think the vast majority, if not every Republican senator, could support as well. So I've suggested to the administration and others that there is a path forward to getting this ratified in this Congress. It will require, by the way, that these changes be in the implementing legislation, not reopening the negotiations with Canada and Mexico. So that's a doable path, it seems to me. The alternative is the administration waits till next year and then begins discussions with Nancy Pelosi. Now, we've seen that movie run before. We have seen what has happened in the past when a Republican president has handed a free trade agreement to Speaker Pelosi, and she never moved it. In fact, she turned off TPA, refused to put it on the floor, never had a vote, and it was only years later when Republicans took control of the Congress that the Colombia Free Trade Agreement in South Korea were even able to be voted on. So there's two very divergent paths with potentially very different outcomes. I'm urging the president to work with those of us who would like to have a free trade agreement.
Well, and without trying to get too much into the sausage you're making, you've only got limited number of legislative days to get that done. You've got a spending bill that's got to get passed to keep the government running. Does the administration, does the President of the United States agree with you enough to put all of his clout behind getting this done? Because I suspect that is what it would take.
Well, except that it's a free option to go down the road that I'm suggesting. And because procedurally, the only thing the White House needs to do is deliver to Congress the actual documents, the text, the legal text of the agreement. Deliver it to us. Now, they're running out of time. It has to be by the end of this month. If they do that, then they have the option of passing it in this Congress if they can negotiate an acceptable agreement and find the time on the Senate and House floors. And if they can't, then there's always next year. But if they don't get the documents to us on time, then they don't have an option this year, and they're going to be at the tender mercies of the new speaker.
Okay, talking about tender mercies, let's talk about what's going to go on down in Buenos Aires for a moment. As you saw, the president gave an interview with the Wall Street Journal yesterday, where he was fairly aggressive in saying he's going to put more tariffs on the remaining amount of Chinese imports if we don't get a deal in Buenos Aires. What do you make of this strategy? Is he sincere that he's going to go ahead and impose the more tariffs, or is this a negotiating strategy?
Well, this president likes tariffs. Now, I don't, right? When we impose tariffs on imports, it's just a tax on American consumers. I'm not a fan, but the president is. And so if he's threatening to impose more tariffs, people should take that very, very seriously. You know, I'm very skeptical that this is the right path to getting the agreement we need with China. I mean, I think it's in our interest, it's in China's interest, to have an end to this escalating trade war. But it does mean China's got to change its ways. My view is that the real problem is not the size of the deficit. The real problem is the systematic theft of American intellectual property. And that should be the priority that the administration should negotiate for. If we could get that problem solved, I think in return we should drop the tariffs that we've imposed, that the president's imposed, and we would both be much better off.
How much influence does the Senate have in this process? Because according to the Constitution, you should have a fairly substantial role. Judging, for example, from what happened with Nafta 2.0 or USMCA, whatever you want to call it, as a practical matter, are you able to influence the president? This is a president, after all, from your political party.
Yeah. Well, in fairness to the president, he is very, very engaged with senators. I speak with the president periodically. Anytime I want to talk to him about this, he knows I disagree with him, and yet he still returns my call quickly, and we have a thoughtful, substantive conversation. So he listens. I'm not sure I'm able to persuade him, but you make a very strong point, which is the Constitution is unambiguous about this. Trade policy, and specifically tariffs, are the realm of Congress. It has been Congress's mistake over decades to cede this authority to the president, and I happen to think we should take that authority back.
And finally, Senator, you have said that there should be some sort of investigation into the granting of waivers under the 232 with respect to steel and aluminum. What are you looking for there? What have you heard? What do you know?
Well, what I know is that we have this massive backlog of American companies. I have Pennsylvania constituents, companies that are very adversely affected by these steel and aluminum tariffs, and in many, many cases, they have no choice but to buy these from overseas. It could be, often it's a sole supplier overseas, and the rationale for the tariff, it doesn't stand in those circumstances. So they're supposed to be able to get a waiver, and the process has been terribly slow. It seems inconsistent. It's not sufficiently transparent, and so I and some of my colleagues have written a letter to the GAO to do an investigation. Let's find out what's actually going on. What is this process? Why is it taking so long? How do we get it fixed?
Talk about your constituents in Pennsylvania. Overall, are they better off for President Trump's trade policy at this point, taking it all into account, the revisions of Nafta, the really standoff at this point with China, as well as the imposition of the tariffs on steel and aluminum? Are your constituents overall better off for this trade policy?
So my constituents are much better off because of the overall economic policy, right, which is dramatic tax reform, rolling back of excessive regulations. But the actual trade policy that's been implemented, that's mostly been increased tariffs, right? The new Nafta has not yet gone into effect, but steel and aluminum tariffs have gone up, and the net effect of that for my constituents on balance has been negative. There are far more people who are employed by and who are consumers of steel and aluminum using industries than there are people who are actually producers. Yeah, this has helped the producers. It's raised the cost of steel and aluminum. But there are an awful lot more people who are adversely affected by that.